Beside my father's coffin, my brother Michael's grip on my arm was a vice. Don't pretend you're sad, Olivia," he whispered, "a cruel private poison. You're a disgrace. You're only here for his money." And he saw a grieving daughter he could break. He didn't know he was looking at the executor of his downfall. His inheritance was about to go up in flames. And I am Olivia Hayes. I am 28 years old, and today I am an island. The funeral parlor was suffocating. The air, thick and still, carried the cloying sweetness of too many white lilies, a scent that clung to the back of my throat like a promise of decay. It mixed with the faint, antique smell of lemon polish and old wood, the signature fragrance of a place that profits from sorrow. Muted light from stained glass windows painted soft, mournful colors on the plush burgundy carpet, soaking up all sound except for the discreet, performative sniffles that echoed from the main gathering. In from my corner, I watched them. Aunts, uncles, cousins, business associates, a sea of black and navy blue, huddled together in clusters of feigned grief. They were a constellation of mourners, and I was a dark, empty space between the stars. Then my hand was buried in the pocket of my black wool coat, my fingers wrapped tightly around a small, smooth river stone. It was cool and solid, its familiar weight a secret anchor in the turbulent, emotional waters. Dad and I had found it on a riverbank in Vermont a lifetime ago. It was a worthless, inanimate object to anyone else, but to me, it was the only thing in this room that felt real. It was the last remaining bridge to a past where his love for me was as simple and certain as the current that had polished this stone. And then the whispers started. They weren't loud, but they were sharp, designed to travel just far enough. I didn't need to see their faces to know who they belonged to. My Aunt Carol, my cousin Mark, their voices were tiny, sharp needles, pricking the fragile numbness I had carefully constructed around myself. "And look at her, not even crying," one voice murmured. "Just stands there." "In ungrateful," another added, the word dripping with sanctimonious pity. "After everything Jonathan did for her, throwing it all away to be an artist in New York. Now she's back. Funny how that works when there's money on the table." Skin on money. The word was a slap. Each syllable was a judgment, a verdict delivered by a jury of people who knew nothing of the late-night phone calls that went unanswered, the birthday cards that were never acknowledged, the chasm that had been methodically dug between my father and me. They saw only the surface, the estranged daughter who had returned for the reading of the will. And they had already found me guilty. I squeezed the stone in my pocket, its hard edges digging into my palm, the physical pain a welcome distraction from the inferno of injustice igniting in my chest. And then the main prosecutor approached, and my brother Michael detached himself from a circle of sympathetic businessmen and strode across the room. He wore his grief like he wore his custom-tailored suit, impeccably and without a single genuine wrinkle. A mask of profound sorrow was expertly arranged on his face, but it couldn't hide the cold, triumphant light in his eyes. It was the same look he got when he closed a hostile takeover. And he stopped in front of me, blocking my view of our father's casket. He leaned in, his cologne overwhelming the scent of the lilies. And beside my father's coffin, his grip on my arm was a vice. "Don't pretend you're sad, Olivia," he whispered, "a cruel private poison meant only for me. You're a disgrace. You're only here for his money." The air left my lungs in a silent rush. The world narrowed to his sneering face, his words echoing in the sudden ringing void. For heartbeat, I felt the primal urge to scream, to claw at that perfect mask of his, to expose the rot underneath for everyone to see. But I didn't. And in that moment of pure, white-hot fury, a strange and powerful calm washed over me. I would not give him the satisfaction of my tears. I would not give him the drama he craved. My silence became my shield, my final act of defiance. I met his gaze, holding it for a long, unwavering second, letting him see the barren landscape of my contempt. And then I broke eye contact, deliberately looking past his shoulder, my focus landing on the polished mahogany of the casket at the front of the room. It was a silent dismissal. You are nothing. He is everything. He let go of my arm with a disgusted scoff and melted back into the crowd, his duty done. The whispers died down, but the chill he left behind remained. I stood there, alone again, the smooth, cold stone in my hand, the only proof of a time before all of this. My eyes remained fixed on the casket, the last earthly home of the man who taught me how to fish, how to laugh, and how to be brave. A fleeting image flashed behind my eyes, sunlight dappling on the water of a lake, the sound of his deep, rumbling laugh as I reeled in a tiny sunfish. And then a question, raw and desperate, formed in the depths of my soul, a silent whisper to the man I could no longer hear. And how, Dad? How did it all come to this? There was a time when we were everything to each other. And the question I'd whispered to my father's coffin hung in the stale, lily-scented air, and the funeral parlor around me dissolved. The stiff wool of my coat softened into a worn-out flannel shirt, and the scent of lemon polish was replaced by the rich, earthy smell of damp soil and pine needles after a morning rain. I was a child again, maybe 10 years old, perched on a sun-warmed boulder on the banks of the Connecticut River. And those were our sacred days. My father, Jonathan Hayes, a man who commanded boardrooms and navigated the shark-infested waters of Boston real estate, would shed his corporate armor. He'd trade his Italian leather shoes for scuffed hiking boots and become just Dad. Our sanctuary was the river, and our ritual was fishing. And he'd taught me everything. How to read the subtle ripples on the water's surface, how to tie a clinch knot with fingers numb from the cold, and most importantly, how to be patient. We'd sit for hours in companionable silence, the only sounds being the gentle lapping of the water and the cry of a distant hawk. For me, it wasn't about catching fish. It was about catching these fleeting, perfect moments with him. "Anna, you see, Olivia," he'd say, his voice a low, comforting rumble as he pointed with his fishing rod. "Her business is just like fishing. You have to find the right spot, where the opportunities are. You need the right bait. That's your product, your pitch. And you need patience. You can't force a deal, just like you can't force a fish to bite. You wait, you watch, and you know exactly when to set the hook." Atenai would nod, absorbing his words not as business lessons, but as parables of life. His world of concrete and steel seemed a million miles away, yet he found a way to translate it into our language of rivers and reeds. In those moments, I felt seen. I wasn't just his daughter, I was his confidant, the quiet apprentice to his grand philosophy of life. I was proud to be the keeper of this secret, softer side of him. And Michael was sometimes there, too, but he was never truly present. Even as a boy, he was a creature of a different element. While Dad and I were watching the water, my brother, 2 years my senior, would be skipping stones with a competitive fury, counting how many times they bounced. He wasn't interested in the patient waiting. He wanted results, numbers, things he could measure and boast about. Dad, I got 7 skips, a new record," he'd shout, shattering the peaceful quiet. And my father would offer a distracted "Yerutoing. That's great, son," before turning his attention back to the subtle twitch of his fishing line. I saw the flicker of disappointment in Michael's eyes then, the beginning of a hunger for an approval he felt was unfairly given to me. He couldn't understand that what Dad and I shared wasn't measured in skips or scores. It was a silent, intuitive connection, a shared rhythm that he simply couldn't hear. He saw my quiet presence beside our father not as love, but as a strategic maneuver he couldn't replicate. And so he began to resent it. In the river of my childhood flowed peacefully for years until we reached the fork. The moment that changed everything didn't happen by the water. It happened in the heart of my father's empire, his cavernous, oak-paneled office on the top floor of the Hayes Properties building in downtown Boston. And I was 18, filled with the terrifying, exhilarating certainty of my future. I had spent months compiling a portfolio of my artwork, charcoal sketches, vibrant oil paintings, photographs that captured the soul of the city. My acceptance letter to the Rhode Island School of Design, one of the best art schools in the country, was clutched in my hand like a golden ticket. I remember the smell of his office, old leather, paper, and the faint, clean scent of his aftershave. He was behind his massive desk, a fortress of mahogany, studying blueprints under a pool of light from a green banker's lamp. He looked up when I came in, a rare, tired smile gracing his lips. "Olivia, what's the good word?" My heart hammered against my ribs as I laid the portfolio on his desk. I explained my passion, the life I envisioned for myself, the undeniable pull I felt towards creating. I showed him the acceptance letter, my voice trembling with hope. "This is it, Dad. This is what I want to do. It'll." The smile on his face didn't just fade. It was extinguished. He leaned back in his leather chair, the soft groan of it filling the sudden, heavy silence. He steepled his fingers, his gaze dropping from my hopeful face to the vibrant paintings, but he wasn't seeing them. He was seeing liabilities, uncertain futures, a deviation from the plan he had unknowingly authored for me. "You art school," he said, the words flat and devoid of emotion. "Trizd, that's an expensive hobby, Olivia." It's not a hobby, Dad," I pleaded, my voice smaller now. It's who I am, Ekin." "Who you are is a haze," he countered, his voice hardening. You have a mind for strategy. I see it when we're on the river. You're smart. You could go to Boston College, get a business degree. You could join me here. Michael is the numbers man, but you have the vision, the instincts." The praise felt like a cage. He was complimenting a version of me that he wanted, not the person standing before him. We argued. It wasn't loud or shouting, which made it all the more devastating. It was a tense, quiet battle of two immovable wills. I spoke of passion and purpose. He spoke of stock portfolios and financial security. He saw my dream as a frivolous, irresponsible risk. I saw his plan as a gilded prison. The final blow came when I refused to back down. He stood up, his shadow looming over the desk. The warmth was gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound, cutting disappointment I had never seen before. It was a look that would haunt my waking and sleeping hours for the next decade. "So I thought you were different, Olivia," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "I thought you were a fighter, like me. I see now I was wrong." That sentence broke something inside me. It wasn't just his disapproval. It was the implication that my choice, my very essence, was a form of weakness. He had mistaken my quiet strength for a lack of ambition, my different path for a lesser one. The connection we shared, the one forged in the quiet understanding by the river, had just been severed by the cold logic of the boardroom. And I walked out of his office that day, my portfolio feeling like a lead weight in my arms, and my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I was heartbroken, but in the blind optimism of youth, I was also naively certain that time would heal his disappointment. I believed that once he saw me succeed, once he understood, the river would flow as one again. And I didn't know that someone else had been watching from the shadows, listening to the crack of our breaking bond. I didn't know that Michael was waiting, ready to pour salt into that fresh, gaping wound, and to patiently, methodically turn a simple crack into an unbridgeable chasm. And the years following my departure for art school were a slow, grinding erosion of hope. I had left Boston with a broken heart, but also a stubborn belief that my father's love was a bedrock, temporarily hidden by his disappointment. I believed my success would eventually prove my path worthy. I just had to keep reaching out. So my efforts began as a weekly ritual. Every Sunday evening from my tiny Brooklyn apartment that smelled of turpentine, I would call home. In the beginning, my heart pounded with a hopeful rhythm. This time he'll answer, Chin, but he never did. It was always Michael. Chin Hay's residence, he'd answer, his voice smooth and professional, as if I were a client. Intanen. Hey, Mike, it's me. Is Dad around? In the excuses were always plausible, always delivered with a tone of sympathetic concern that was maddeningly convincing. Ah, Liv, you just missed him. He's in a big conference call with West Coast investors. Or, he's exhausted, just fell asleep on the couch. I'll tell him you called. And week after week, the wall of polite excuses grew higher. Dad was at a charity dinner. Dad had a headache. Dad was on the golf course. Each excuse was a small, neat brick laid by my brother's careful hands. I didn't see the prison he was building around my father. I only felt the chill of its shadow. The hope in my chest began to fray, replaced by a dull ache of confusion. And my attempts weren't limited to phone calls. I poured my heart into tangible things, desperate to send a piece of my world to him. For his birthday, I spent a month painting a small landscape of the riverbank where we used to fish. I sent it with a long letter describing my classes, my small triumphs. On silence, not a call, not a text, not even a simple thanks, relayed through Michael. When my first group exhibition was held in a Chelsea gallery, I designed a special invitation myself. I sent it with a handwritten note. Dad, it would mean the world to me if you could see this. I think you'd be proud. In the night of the opening, I scanned the crowd every time the gallery door opened, my stomach fluttering with foolish hope. He never came. When I next called, Michael's voice was laced with gentle reproach. Oh, Liv, he had that fundraiser for the mayor on his calendar for months. He felt terrible he couldn't make it. Each unanswered gesture was a stone dropped into a bottomless well. I'd hear the initial splash of my effort, followed by an endless, echoing silence. It felt like my love, my work, my very existence was being received, and then immediately discarded like junk mail. The question began to fester. Was it Michael's excuses, or was my father actively choosing to ignore me? The final definitive crack in my spirit happened a few years later. I was 25 and had just sold my first major piece. The check was more money than I'd ever seen. My first thought was to drive to Boston to show my father that his hobby could be a career. I wanted to see his surprise and maybe a glimmer of pride. I called Michael to make sure Dad would be home. "That's fantastic news, Liv," he said, his enthusiasm sounding so genuine it hurt. "Yeah, he'll be here. Saturday would be perfect. He'll be so thrilled." The 3-hour drive up I-95 was a blur of giddy anticipation. I imagined the weight of his years of disappointment finally lifting. I pulled into the familiar driveway, my heart soaring. But it was Michael who opened the grand front door. His face was a mask of apology. "Anne and Olivia, I am so sorry," he said, stepping out to block my way. "You won't believe this. An emergency meeting just came up. Dad had to fly to Chicago this morning. He tried to call you, but you were already on the road. He feels absolutely awful." The hopeful scene in my mind shattered. I stood on the doorstep, the joy draining out of me like air from a punctured lung. "Oh," I managed. Come in," Michael insisted, ushering me into the cavernous, cold living room. The family photos on the mantelpiece seemed to mock me. I sat stiffly on the edge of a silk-upholstered armchair as Michael chattered about the company. I could barely hear him. All I could feel was the vast, crushing emptiness of that house and the finality of my father's absence. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. And after an hour of polite, soul-destroying small talk, I made my excuses and drove the 3 hours back to New York in numb despair, the silence in my car a roaring testament to my failure. And that was the day I stopped trying. That was the day I finally believed the lie Michael had so carefully crafted. My father didn't want to see me. He didn't care about my achievements. The girl he had loved by the river was gone, replaced by a daughter who had disappointed him one too many times. So I accepted my fate as the discarded daughter. I built a wall around my own heart to protect what was left of it, brick by painful brick. On until one day, a faulty beat in my father's heart became the sledgehammer that would accidentally shatter that wall of lies. Then I learned what happened next much later, pieced together from tearful confessions and meticulous legal documents. At the time, I was in New York, living inside the cold reality I had accepted. But in Boston, the sledgehammer was about to fall. It all started with a minor heart attack, a warning shot from my father's own body. And the doctors ordered him to work from home for a month. No stress, no travel. For my father, Jonathan Hayes, a man whose identity was welded to his corner office, this was a prison sentence. Stripped of his command center at Hayes Properties, he was a restless lion pacing a gilded cage. He was cut off from the daily flow of information, the casual conversations, the subtle power plays. For the first time in years, he was outside the fortress of information Michael had built around him. In one rainy Tuesday afternoon, frustrated and bored, he found himself searching for an old zoning file from a project a decade prior. He knew Michael kept copies of older company records in his home office, a room my father rarely entered. He walked into the study, a space dominated by a sleek, modern desk, so different from his own traditional mahogany fortress. And he began opening drawers, his frustration mounting as he sifted through Michael's obsessively organized files. The document wasn't where it should have been. Annoyed, he tried the bottom right drawer. It stuck. He pulled harder, rattling it in its tracks. With a grunt of exertion, he gave it one final forceful tug. The drawer flew open with a sharp crack, its contents spilling onto the floor in a silent, colorful cascade. And it wasn't files that fell out. It was a flood of memories, my memories, a torrent of thick, creamy cardstock, vibrant watercolor paper, and crisp envelopes. My father froze, staring at the pile on the floor as if a ghost had just appeared. He bent down slowly, his hand trembling slightly as he picked up the first item. It was the small painted landscape of our fishing spot on the river, the one I'd sent for his birthday years ago. He turned it over. The long letter I had written was still tucked inside, the envelope sealed. It had never been opened. A cold dread, sharp and unfamiliar, pierced through his frustration. He picked up another. It was the invitation to my first art exhibition, my proud, hopeful handwriting. Staring up at him from the card, the envelope was also sealed. He picked up another and another, a birthday card with a sketch of his old fishing hat on the front, a Christmas card with a winter scene of the Boston Public Garden, a postcard from a weekend trip I'd taken to Maine. In all of them sealed, all of them unopened, a museum of my unanswered love, curated and hidden away by his own son. Then for a long moment he didn't move. He simply knelt there on the floor, surrounded by a decade of my intercepted affections. The air in the room grew thin. The polite excuses Michael had fed him over the years began to play back in his mind, but now they sounded different. They were no longer plausible reasons, but brittle, transparent lies. Sinan. She didn't call this week, Dad? Guess she's busy? Another gallery thing. You know Olivia, always chasing some new project. I think she's still upset about our talk. She just needs space. The image of my hopeful 18-year-old face in his office, the day he had broken my heart, flashed before his eyes. He had believed our rift was born of his own harsh words. He had carried that guilt for years, a heavy private burden. But this was different. This wasn't a rift born of disappointment. This was a systematic, calculated campaign of sabotage. The initial shock gave way to a cold, hard certainty, and with that certainty came an anger so profound, so deep, it was utterly silent. It was not the explosive rage of a wronged man, but the chilling, focused fury of a king who discovers a traitor in his most trusted circle. And he did not storm out of the room. He did not confront his son. The fisherman in him, the patient strategist he had always tried to teach me to be, took over. He carefully gathered every last card, every letter, every unopened piece of my heart, and placed them back in the drawer, closing it softly. He now knew the truth, but he needed to understand the scope of the betrayal. And that evening he sat alone in the dark of his study, the only light coming from the city glowing outside his window. He picked up his private phone and made a single call. "Stemroy Jenkins," he said, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the storm raging inside him. It's Jonathan Hayes. I need to see you tomorrow, and I need you to hire the best private investigator you know. No questions asked. I want him to start immediately. In." The investigation began, a quiet hunt for the truth, and what it would unearth was not just a family's deception, but a malignancy growing within the company my father had spent his life building. The private investigator my father hired, was a man named Peterson, a former detective, discreet and ruthlessly efficient. He moved like a ghost through the records and relationships of Hayes Properties. 2 weeks after he was hired, the first report landed on my father's desk. It was a thick, spiral-bound document, its contents more devastating than my father could have ever imagined. Mr. Jenkins, our family lawyer, was there when he read it, and it was he who later recounted the quiet horror of that afternoon to me. The investigation had uncovered 2 distinct threads of deception, each twisting around the other to form a sickening rope of betrayal. The first thread was personal. It was me. N. Peterson had interviewed my father's longtime executive assistant, a woman named Carol who had recently retired. Under the assurance of confidentiality, she opened up. Her sworn statement was a gut punch. Mr. Michael Hayes instructed me years ago, shortly after Miss Olivia went to college. The statement read, all calls from her were to be routed directly to his line. Any mail, packages, or correspondence addressed to his father from her were to be placed on his desk, not his father's. He said he was managing the situation to reduce his father's stress. It was all there in black and white. The systematic, cold-blooded severing of our connection. The report even included logs from the office's front desk noting my visits, followed by Michael's notations. Father unavailable. Each entry was a small, sharp nail hammered into the coffin of our relationship. My father read this section first, his face growing pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. But as Mr. Jenkins told me, that was only the surface wound. The true sickness lay deeper, in the heart of the business itself. The second thread of the investigation was a deep dive into the company's recent projects, the ones Michael had been overseeing with increasing autonomy. What Peterson found was not just mismanagement, it was a pattern of deliberate, calculated fraud. On the report detailed the South Boston waterfront condo project, Michael's flagship development. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. There were copies of emails between Michael and a subcontractor explicitly discussing the use of substandard drywall and cheaper, non-approved wiring to cut costs. We can save close to $1 million on this, one of Michael's emails read. The inspectors are on our side. No one will ever know. Then there were inflated invoices from shell companies, channeling money directly into a private account Michael held offshore. There were records of payments, euphemistically labeled as consulting fees, made to 2 key city officials who had conveniently fast-tracked zoning permits and overlooked code violations. In it was a portrait of breathtaking greed. Michael wasn't just isolating me to secure his position as the favored son. He was actively gutting the company from the inside out, risking the safety of future residents and tarnishing the name my father had spent 40 years building into a symbol of quality and integrity. Hayes Properties wasn't just a business to my father, it was his legacy, the tangible proof of his life's work. And his own son, the one he had anointed as his successor, was treating it like a piggy bank to be smashed open. Son Mr. Jenkins described the moment my father finished reading the last page. He didn't yell, he didn't curse, he simply closed the binder with a soft, final thud. He sat there for a long time, staring out the window at the Boston skyline he had helped to shape, but his eyes were seeing something else entirely. They were seeing the full, horrifying scope of his son's character. And the pain of being deceived about me was immense, but this was a different level of agony. This was the soul-crushing realization that the child you raised, the one you trusted with your life's work, was a stranger. Worse than a stranger, a parasite. A man devoid of the 2 things my father valued above all else, loyalty and honor. He saw now that Michael's ambition wasn't to build, but to plunder. His son didn't want to inherit a kingdom. He wanted to strip it for parts and sell it for scrap. And in that moment, the disappointment he had once felt towards me for choosing art over business must have seemed like a laughable, trivial thing. I had chosen a different path, but I had done so with honesty and passion. Michael had stayed, but he had done so with deceit and a heart full of avarice. The son who looked the part was the one who was rotten to the core. And when my father finally turned to face Mr. Jenkins, The grief in his eyes was ancient and profound, but underneath it, a new, hard resolve had formed. The time for sorrow was over. It was now time for justice. My father's response wasn't a loud confrontation. It was a silent, calculated plan drawn up during sleepless nights with his lawyer. A last will and testament written in the ink of regret and righteous anger. A plan whose final stage would be set in this very lawyer's office, where I now sat, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break. And the day of the will reading arrived with a cold gray drizzle that felt like it was weeping just for me. You know that feeling, right? When the weather outside seems to perfectly match the storm inside your own heart. That's how it was as I walked into the downtown Boston law offices of Jenkins and Associates. I felt less like a daughter and more like a defendant walking to her sentencing. My only goal was to get through it with what little dignity I had left. St. Mr. Jenkins's conference room was exactly as intimidating as you'd imagine. The walls were lined with mahogany bookshelves, filled with leather-bound legal books that seemed to suck all the light and sound out of the air. It smelled of old paper, leather, and a faint hint of brewing coffee. A long, polished table dominated the room, its surface reflecting the gloomy yellowed light from the antique lamps. I chose a chair at the far end, trying to make myself as small as possible. One by one, the others filed in. My aunts, my uncles, their spouses. They'd nod at me with that look. Have you ever gotten it? That quick, pitying glance that's really just a thin veneer over judgment. They clustered together at the other end of the table, a united front. And then Michael made his entrance. He wasn't just walking, he was presiding. He strode to the head of the table, the chair that was so obviously meant for the heir apparent, and sat down with this air of absolute confidence. He shot me a brief, triumphant smirk. It was a look that said, "The game is over, I've won." I just stared back, my face a carefully constructed blank. I had already accepted my fate. It was all his. I just wanted it to be over. And the room fell into this heavy, oppressive silence. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick echoing the frantic beat of my own heart. And at precisely 10 o'clock, the door opened and Mr. Jenkins entered. He was a man in his late 60s, tall and thin, with a face that seemed incapable of showing any emotion. He placed his worn leather briefcase on the table, and the solid, definitive thud it made was the loudest sound I'd heard all morning. Everyone sat up straighter. I saw Michael lean forward, a hungry glint in his eyes. But Mr. Jenkins didn't pull out the will. Instead, he took out a small remote control. With a quiet click, a large flat-screen television, which I hadn't even noticed against the dark wall, flickered to life. A confused murmur rippled through the room. Michael's smirk faltered, replaced by an annoyed frown. He hated theatrics he couldn't control. And me. I felt this strange sense of calm wash over me. It's what happens, I guess, when you truly believe you have nothing left to lose. So Mr. Jenkins stood at the head of the table, commanding the room without raising his voice. He let the silence stretch, his gaze moving slowly from face to face. When his eyes met mine, they seemed to hold for a second too long. It wasn't pity, it was something else, something I couldn't read. And it sent a tiny, unexpected shiver down my spine. And then he spoke, his voice calm and clear. "Before we begin with the terms of the will," he announced, "Mr. Jonathan Hayes had one final request. He wanted to speak to you all himself one last time." A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Michael looked like he'd been struck. And Mr. Jenkins aimed the remote at the screen and pressed a single button. And play. The screen flickered to life, and the collective breath of the room hitched. And then, there he was, my father. And it wasn't the powerful, commanding image of the man I remembered from his office, nor the carefree man from the riverbank of my childhood. This was a version of him I had never seen. He was sitting in his favorite leather armchair in his home study, the one that caught the afternoon sun. He looked tired, impossibly so. He was thinner, the sharp lines of his face softened by weariness, and the skin under his eyes was bruised with a fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. But his eyes were clear. They were focused, looking directly into the camera lens with a raw, unflinching intensity. It felt like he was looking right at me, right through the screen and across the chasm of time and death. And the room was utterly, profoundly silent. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to have stopped. My own breathing felt like a loud intrusion. I could feel the weight of everyone's shocked stares, but I couldn't look away from the screen. And then he spoke, and his voice, though weaker than I remembered, was filled with a clarity that cut through the silence. "Stinny, if you are watching this," he began, his gaze steady, "it means I'm gone. I have a few things to say, and I ask that you give me the courtesy of listening to the end." His eyes scanned the camera as if picturing each person in the room. Then they settled and my heart stopped. He was looking at me. "Nyan Olivia," he said, and my name on his lips was a sound I hadn't realized how desperately I'd missed. It was a key turning in a lock deep inside me. "My daughter, most of what I have to say is for you." And I felt a tremor start in my hands. A hand flew to my mouth to stifle a sob that threatened to escape. Around me, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to stunned disbelief. "And as for 10 years," my father continued, his voice thick with a regret so palpable it felt like a physical presence in the room. "I have lived with a heavy heart. I made you believe that I was disappointed in you. I made you believe that your choices, your art, your very spirit, were a source of shame for me. I let a rift form between us, and I let it grow into a canyon. And for that, I am so, so sorry." And the word sorry hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was the word I had longed to hear for a decade, a word I had given up on ever hearing. I couldn't process it. My mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the man on the screen with the distant, disapproving father I had constructed in my memory. "Han, I was a fool," he said, his voice cracking for the first time. "A proud, stubborn fool. But I was not just a fool, I was also blind. I allowed myself to be lied to be manipulated." He recounted the story of the stuck drawer, of finding the cascade of my unopened letters and cards. He described the cold, sickening realization of what had been done. "I was shielded from your love, Olivia, deliberately, and I was too busy, too arrogant, to see the walls being built around me." And I could feel the stares of my aunts and uncles now, no longer on me, but shifting, turning towards the head of the table. I risked a glance. Michael was sitting ramrod straight in his chair, his face a mask of pale, rigid fury. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, bloodless line. His knuckles were white where he gripped the table's edge. He looked like a statue cracking from the inside out. Juan, my father on the screen, wasn't finished. He seemed to gather himself, a new strength entering his voice. "Chno. But my greatest regret," he said, his eyes finding the camera again, finding me, "is not just that I let myself be deceived. It's that I didn't have enough faith in you, Olivia, and in myself." and the screen behind him changed. It cut from his face to a high-resolution image of a painting. My painting! It was a piece from my first gallery show, a sprawling, abstract cityscape of New York at dusk, all deep blues and explosive bursts of electric yellow. I remembered it vividly. It was the first piece I ever sold. "I told you I couldn't make it to your first exhibition," my father's voiceover said, now filled with a quiet pride. That was a lie I was told to believe. The truth is, I was there. The image changed again, showing another of my paintings, then another and another, a highlight reel of my career, of my soul splashed across the screen. "I have followed your career since the day you left for college. I have seen every show. I have read every review. When you sold your first piece, I was the anonymous buyer from a Swiss holding company." M&A collective audible gasp went through the room. My mind went blank. The Swiss buyer, the mysterious collector who had given me my start, whose faith had propelled my career forward. It had been him. All along, it had been him. In the tears I had been holding back, finally broke free. They weren't tears of just sorrow anymore. They were tears of shock, of vindication, of a profound and overwhelming love that had been there all along, hiding in the shadows. It was a decade of pain and misunderstanding, melting away in a hot, cleansing flood. I wept silently, my whole body shaking with the force of the revelation. Then the image on the screen returned to my father's face. He looked exhausted, but a small, sad smile touched his lips. "Son, I never knew how to tell you," he said softly. "I was trapped in my own pride, trapped by the lies I was being fed. You were the brave one, Olivia. You had the courage to follow your own path, to be who you were meant to be. I was the coward." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I was always, always so proud of you. Please believe that." And he looked down for a moment, and the screen went black. Even the silence that descended upon the room was absolute, deafening. It was thick with shame, shock, and the ghost of my father's voice. The image of his tired, earnest face was burned into my mind. I could feel the shift in the room's gravity. All the power, all the judgment had swung away from Michael. His carefully constructed world had just been obliterated by a 10-minute video. I slowly raised my head, my tears blurring the faces of my family, who now stared at me with a mixture of awe and profound embarrassment. Mr. Jenkins let the silence hang for a full minute, allowing the weight of my father's words to settle on every soul in the room. He moved with that same deliberate calm, picking up a thick, ribbon-bound document from his briefcase. And now," he said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade, "for the last will and testament of Mr. Jonathan Hayes." The silence left by the black screen was a physical entity. It pressed in on us, thick with the unspoken shame and shock that now hung over the room. My tears had subsided, leaving behind a strange, hollowed-out calm. I felt like I had been turned inside out, my decade of private grief and vindication laid bare for all to see. I kept my eyes down, focusing on the intricate grain of the mahogany table, trying to anchor myself in the here and now. And Mr. Jenkins, a master of timing and atmosphere, allowed the silence to do its work. He let my family squirm in their seats, let them grapple with the truth they had just been forced to witness. Finally, with the tension stretched to its breaking point, he cleared his throat. "Hun, and now," he said, his voice a calm, steady anchor in the churning sea of emotion, "for the last will and testament of Mr. Jonathan Hayes." He lifted the thick, ribbon-bound document from his briefcase. The rustle of the paper was like a gunshot in the quiet room. And he untied the ribbon with deliberate, practiced hands and began to read in a dry, legal monotone that made the explosive contents all the more shocking. He started with a few minor bequests to distant relatives and my father's favorite charities. I could feel the impatience radiating from Michael's end of the table. This was all just preamble to him, the final moments before his coronation. And then Mr. Jenkins paused, took a sip of water, and looked directly at my brother. To my son, Michael Jonathan Hayes. Michael straightened his tie, a flicker of his old arrogance returning to his face. This was it. When I leave the sum of $500,000, Mr. Jenkins read, his voice flat, and the amount hung in the air, so shockingly small, in the context of the Hayes fortune that for a moment nobody reacted. It was a respectable amount of money for anyone, but for the presumed heir of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, it was a profound public slap in the face. I saw Michael's brow furrow in confusion. He must have misheard. But Mr. Jenkins continued, "This sum is to be paid out in annual installments of $50,000 for a period of 10 years. Ijananelo gasp came from my Aunt Carol. An annuity, not a lump sum, a controlled, measured allowance. In these payments, Mr. Jenkins read on, his voice unwavering, are contingent upon Michael adhering to a strict and moral turpitude clause. He must not be convicted of any crime, felony, or misdemeanor. Furthermore, the payments are conditional upon his full and complete cooperation with any internal or external audits of Hayes properties conducted within the next 5 years. The executor of my estate holds full discretion to suspend or terminate these payments should these conditions not be met." And the color drained from Michael's face. It went from confusion to disbelief, then to a sickly pale white. This wasn't an inheritance, it was a leash. A golden leash, perhaps, but a leash nonetheless, designed to keep him in line and ensure his silence. It was a severance package, not a succession plan. Every eye in the room was now fixed on him, watching his carefully constructed composure shatter. And Mr. Jenkins, oblivious or perhaps perfectly aware of the drama he was conducting, turned the page. He adjusted his glasses. Saw the rest of my estate, including my personal effects, my primary residence in Boston, Massachusetts, and my entire personal investment portfolio, I leave to... He paused for a fraction of a second. A masterful, cruel bit of theater. And I held my breath. I expected nothing. After the video, the vindication was enough. I didn't need or want anything else. Ianium, my beloved daughter, Olivia Marie Hayes. And the words didn't register at first. They floated in the air, nonsensical syllables. My beloved daughter. The phrase itself was a gift more precious than any fortune. Then the rest of it crashed down on me. The house, the portfolio. It was too much. My mind, still reeling from the emotional upheaval of the video, simply couldn't process it. But there was more. The final earth-shattering blow. Furthermore, Mr. Jenkins continued, his voice resonating with the weight of this final provision, I bequeath my 51% controlling interest in Hayes Properties, LLC, to my daughter, Olivia Marie Hayes, to do with as she sees fit. Iman 51%, zone controlling interest. The numbers echoed in the silent room. It wasn't just an inheritance, it was the entire kingdom. The keys to the empire, the power, all of it handed to me, the outcast, the dreamer, the artist. I stared at Mr. Jenkins, my mouth agape, searching his impassive face for any sign that this was a mistake, a cruel joke. But there was none. On from the head of the table came a sound, a strangled guttural noise of pure rage. Michael shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. His face was now a terrifying mask of crimson fury. "And no," he roared, his voice cracking. "This is insane. He was not in his right mind. I won't allow it." He pointed a trembling finger at me, his eyes wild with hatred. "She did this. She manipulated him. The senile old fool. I will contest this. I will sue. I will drag this through the courts for years." And the room erupted into panicked whispers. My aunts and uncles looked terrified, caught in the crossfire. Zay and I remained seated, frozen, not by fear, but by a profound, paralyzing shock. The weight of what had just happened was too immense. I felt like a spectator at my own life. Mr. Jenkins, however, remained an island of perfect calm. He looked at my raging brother, not with anger, but with a sort of detached, clinical pity. He let Michael's threats hang in the air for a moment before speaking, his voice dangerously soft. "Are you sure you want to do that, Michael?" He reached into his briefcase and retrieved a second document, the thick, spiral-bound report from the private investigator. He didn't open it. He simply slid it, slowly and deliberately, across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of Michael's empty chair. "In this," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the room, "is a copy of the investigator's report. It details, among other things, wire fraud, conspiracy, and bribery of public officials. It contains sworn testimony about the deliberate interception of your father's mail. It is, in short, a roadmap to a federal indictment." Annie paused, letting the words sink in. "If you choose to contest the will, this document becomes evidence. It will be made public during discovery. Your business partners, the district attorney, the IRS, they will all be very interested to read it." He looked Michael dead in the eye. "So I ask you again, are you sure?" And checkmate. In the fight drained out of Michael as if a plug had been pulled. The rage in his face was replaced by the chalky white of pure, abject terror. He stared at the report on the table as if it were a venomous snake. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an ally, but all he found were the horrified, accusatory stares of his own family. He was utterly and completely alone, cornered by his own greed. And he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He took a stumbling step back, then another. He looked at me one last time, his eyes filled not with hatred now, but with the dawning horror of his own destruction. Then he turned and fled. He didn't just walk out, he bolted, throwing the conference room door open and running, the door slamming shut behind him with a deafening boom. And the slam echoed in the ensuing silence. The finality of it was absolute. It was the sound of a life imploding. Again, every eye in the room slowly turned to me. The pity and contempt were gone. In their place was a new and unsettling mixture of shock, awe, and raw, undisguised fear. I was no longer the outcast niece, the artistic failure. In the space of 20 minutes, I had become the most powerful person in their world. And in that moment, looking at their stunned faces, I knew my old life was over. And a new one, heavy with a terrifying, crushing responsibility, had just begun. And when the conference room door slammed shut behind Michael, the sound seemed to suck all the remaining air out of the room. A ringing silence filled the void, thick and uncomfortable. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then, as if a spell had been broken, all eyes turned to me. The pity and contempt I was so used to were gone, replaced by a jarring cocktail of shock, fear and a reluctant, calculating respect. In the days that followed, the aftershocks of that explosion continued to ripple through my life. My phone, once silent, began to ring with calls from the very same relatives who had whispered about me at the funeral. The first was my Aunt Carol. "Sen Olivia, dear," she began, her voice dripping with a sweetness that felt artificial. I had no idea. What Michael did, it was monstrous. We're all just so terribly sorry for how things were." And her apology, like the others that followed, was a clumsy, awkward thing. It was a half-hearted attempt to realign themselves with the new center of power. They were sorry, yes, but perhaps more for their bad bet on Michael than for the pain I had endured. I listened politely to each one. I said, "Thank you for calling, and I appreciate that," but I offered nothing more. I was building a new kind of wall now, not one of fear, but one of boundaries. Forgiveness might come one day, but trust had been shattered, and it would not be rebuilt with a few awkward phone calls. The greater challenge, however, wasn't navigating the shifting allegiances of my family. It was navigating the crushing weight of the legacy that had been dropped onto my shoulders. A week later, I found myself standing in the doorway of my father's, now my office, at Hayes Properties. In it was the same formidable, oak-paneled room where my dreams had once been dismissed, but now it was mine. The massive mahogany desk felt like a stranger's fortress. I ran a hand over its cool, polished surface, feeling like an imposter in a dead man's clothes. The transition from a chaotic, paint-splattered studio in Brooklyn to this silent corporate command center was a culture shock so profound it gave me vertigo. My first day was a trial by fire. As Mr. Jenkins and I walked through the halls, I could feel the stares. The senior executives, men who had known me as a child, now looked at me with thinly veiled skepticism. The whispers followed me down the corridor, a different kind of whisper than at the funeral, but just as sharp. "An artist, what does she know about real estate development? This is a disaster. The company will be bankrupt in a year." And they saw a girl who painted pictures. They didn't see the daughter of the man who had taught her that business was like fishing. They didn't know I had been listening all along. Since the first real test came that afternoon, the board of directors held an emergency meeting, and I was sitting in my father's chair at the head of the table. The primary topic was the South Boston waterfront project, Michael's tainted masterpiece. One of the senior VPs, a man named Henderson, argued for pushing forward. "And we've already sunk millions into it," he said, his tone placating, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "Yes, Michael cut some corners, but we can fix the major issues quietly, get the buildings to code, and still turn a significant profit. Halting the project now would be a financial catastrophe." He was appealing to logic, to the bottom line. The old Michael would have agreed. Perhaps even the old Jonathan Hayes, in his prime, might have been tempted, but I wasn't them. I looked at the file in front of me, the one detailing the substandard materials and the falsified safety reports. I thought of the families who would one day live in those apartments, trusting the Hayes name to keep them safe. Ami and I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every skeptical eye in the room. This was my first decision. It would define my leadership. It would define me. "I can, Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice clearer and steadier than I felt. "Profit is important, but the reputation of this company, the integrity of my father's name, is more important." Onai and I looked around the table, meeting each of their gazes. "We are not fixing the issues quietly. We are halting the project immediately. I want a full, independent structural audit of every single building, from the foundation up. We will be transparent with the city. We will replace every substandard component, no matter the cost. We will do it the right way, or we won't do it at all. In a stunned silence fell over the boardroom. Henderson looked like I had slapped him. It was a bold, expensive, and, in their eyes, a naive and emotional decision. But it was the right one. It was a message to them and to myself that Hayes Properties was now under new management, guided by a different compass. Ike and I walked out of that meeting feeling the profound and terrifying loneliness of leadership. I had drawn a line in the sand, not just with my family, but with the very culture of the company I now owned. Said the company was slowly finding its new course. The fractured lines of family were awkwardly mending. But amidst the overwhelming clutter of a tangible legacy of balance sheets and blueprints, I found myself searching for something intangible, something I needed far more. I needed a proper goodbye to my father.
And the months that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, audits, and difficult decisions. I slowly, painstakingly began the process of cleaning up the mess Michael had made, both financially and culturally. The work was exhausting, the responsibility immense, but with each right decision, I felt a little more like I belonged in that formidable office. The company was healing, but I wasn't. And despite the vindication, despite the power, there was a quiet ache in my heart, a sense of unfinished business. The video message had been a gift, but it was a public declaration. I still longed for a private word, a final personal connection to the father I had lost twice, once to misunderstanding and then forever to death. In one Saturday afternoon, I decided to clean out his home study myself. It was a task I had been putting off, but I knew I had to be the one to do it. As I sorted through old papers and books, the late afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating swirling dust motes in the quiet air. Behind a row of thick legal books on the bottom shelf, my fingers brushed against something that wasn't supposed to be there. I pulled it out. In it was a simple, leather-bound journal, worn at the edges, my father's. My heart began to pound. With trembling hands, I sat in his armchair and opened it. The early entries were about business, fishing trips, and frustrations with city politics. But as I flipped toward the end, his familiar, strong handwriting became a little less steady. And the subject changed. It became all about me. And he wrote about the day he found my letters, the shame and rage that had consumed him. He wrote about hiring the investigator, wrote the sickening discoveries of Michael's deceit. He confessed his own pride and stubbornness, his deep regret for ever letting me believe he was disappointed. And she has more courage in her little finger than Michael has in his whole body. One entry read, "She chose a path of passion, not of greed. How could I have been so blind?" Ere I read on, my vision blurring with tears. He wrote about secretly buying my paintings, describing the joy and pride he felt seeing his daughter's soul captured on canvas. He had built a real estate empire, but he had found more beauty in a single brushstroke of mine. And then I reached the final entry. The date was 2 days before he died. Ticked in. "The lawyers have finalized the changes," he wrote. "The plan is in motion, but it's not enough. Will can deliver justice, but it can't deliver love. Next week, I'm going to New York. I'm going to show up at Olivia's studios. I have to see her. I have to tell my little girl that I love her more than anything in this world." A sob tore from my throat, raw and absolute. He was coming for me. After all those years of silence and again, he was finally the coming for me. He had died trying to bridge the chasm between us. I hugged the journal to my chest and cried.
but for the first time, they were not tears of sorrow or anger. They were tears of healing, of a final peaceful release. I had my goodbye. And in that moment, I understood my father's true legacy. It wasn't the company or the money, it was his final desperate act to ensure that a heart full of integrity, not a pocket full of greed, would prevail. Nay, year later, I stood in a bright, sunlit gallery in downtown Boston. The walls were covered with vibrant, hopeful paintings from young, emerging artists. This was the first exhibition sponsored by the newly established Jonathan Hayes Foundation, a nonprofit I had created using a portion of my inheritance to support arts education for talented kids who couldn't afford it. And a young woman, no older than I was, when I'd first confronted my father, approached me, her eyes shining. "Ms. Hayes," she said, her voice filled with emotion. I just wanted to thank you. This grant, it changed my life." And I looked from her grateful face to her painting on the wall. A bold, colorful piece, pulsating with life and courage. I saw my own past in her, and my father's future. His legacy wasn't in steel and glass, it was here, in the dreams he was now helping to build. And I smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that reached my eyes. "You're welcome," I said. "My father would have loved it." And my father's true legacy wasn't a company, it was the love and integrity he passed on. And just like him, each of us has a legacy we are building right now. And if Olivia's journey from heartbreak to healing moved you, please hit that like button so we know these stories matter. Share this video with one person in your life who needs a reminder of their own strength. And now, we want to hear from you. Comment below and tell us, what is one piece of your own legacy you're proud of? And finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story about resilience, justice, and the power of the human spirit. Again, to win.